Greetings. Welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. I'm your host, Ryan Craven, and our guest today is Professor Andrew Libby. Andrew Libby is the Assistant Director of the Human Biology program at IU. This program is an interdisciplinary major in the College of Arts and Sciences that explores the complex human dimensions of scientific inquiry. His current teaching interests revolve around poverty, globalization, and the role of global financial institutions like the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization in international development in emerging markets. Prior to this position in the HUBI, Andrew served as the Community Engagement Coordinator for the IU Service Learning Program, and he has a strong commitment to interdisciplinary, experiential teaching and learning. Andrew, thanks for being here. So you're getting ready to teach the intensive freshman seminar course, food for thought, food policy from local to global. What is that intensive seminar style? And then tell us a little bit about that program.
The intensive freshman seminar program is a really, unique, neat program here at IU where incoming freshmen will come in and take a seminar class. It's usually about 2.5 to 3 weeks. And you can take it on a variety of topics. There are like maybe 20 or 20 plus intensive freshman seminars offered from disciplines all across the university, and the topics range wildly. My class is called Food for Thought, and I'm part of the Human Biology program in the College of Arts and Sciences. My class is on the industrialization of food and its effects locally and globally.
Awesome. What makes this topic so interesting to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually came by this in a winding way. I was mainly interested in globalization. I was interested in the role of the International Monetary Fund and the structural adjustment programs that they broker with developing nations. And I just was looking at the flows of capital. And it seemed to me that they were replicating the time of colonialism, where developing nations were paying huge amounts of debt to their creditors, which were mainly developed nations. And I started to see how that had a really negative effect on farmers, subsistence farmers, especially in some of the poorest nations on the earth. And these policies seemed, if not designed intentionally, although designed intentionally, to kind of squeeze these economies, and it depleted their infrastructure and made it really difficult to be a farmer in these nations. And that might not matter so much in the United States, because who's a farmer? We have 2 million farmers, 2% of the population, I think. Maybe my math isn't so good, but I think it's 2% of the population are farmers now. But in developing nations, you have sometimes upwards of 60, 70% of the population engaged in subsistence agriculture. And a lot of times these are women. So these are issues that really affect food, and globalization really affect people in poverty and women in poverty. And so I thought that was sort of an interesting topic to start to think about.
Yeah, were there any standouts that kind of just really kind of blew your mind, or just was kind of a wow factor when you initially started kind of taking this approach with really the food lens?
Yeah, there were 2 books. Are you asking about books or other texts or experiences I've had?
Yeah, really just whatever, you kind of something you came across and it was just really kind of eye-opening and like piqued that interest even more.
Yeah, two books really. One, I don't know if you know Joseph Stiglitz. He's an economist. He was the chairman of Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors. He's no chump. He's got a Nobel Prize in economics. He teaches at Princeton. And he wrote a book called Globalization and Its Discontents. And it was published in 2001, maybe, something like that. And he really explained in an accessible way for someone like me who was new to the topic of 21st century globalization, what structural adjustment programs were, how they operated, historically what they emerged from, which is something called the Washington Consensus, which was something developed by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 80s. And it was part of a general global push to liberalize trade and to encourage globalization. I think the enactment of NAFTA, the WTO in the 90s sort of followed logically from this, but there was sort of a little bit of a dark side to the story of like happy globalization. And so Stiglitz pointed that out. But I thought he did it in a kind of even-handed way. He didn't, he talked about some of the triumphs of globalization as well as some of the negative consequences of it. And he used a really interesting phrase. He said, he's like, globalization is like, it's a neutral term. He's like, it's not a good term or a bad term. You can have good globalization and you can have bad globalization. I thought that was interesting. And I think the food system is an example of bad globalization because it's driven by perverse economic incentives. It's sort of a market system that's dominated by subsidies from Western nations. And I usually think about the United States, but you could also think about the European Union as well. And these are the most developed economic regions of the globe. They're the ones that subsidize their agriculture most heavily. And this really distorts the market in a lot of ways, both in terms of what ends up on our plate here in Bloomington, Indiana, as well as the opportunity for people in developing nations, in emerging markets, to have a successful, secure food system that's sort of localized and not so vulnerable to kind of exogenous shocks on a globalized supply chain. And so that was one book. So Stiglitz was amazing. It's just amazing. And he's an economist. He could have written a book filled with formulas that nobody could understand, but he didn't. He wrote a book that I think he really wanted people to see this. And then Michael Pollan, who's a very popular author, journalism professor, and food writer at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley, who actually came and spoke at IU a few years ago. It was an interesting talk. He wrote a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma, which I read. And the premise of his book is so interesting. He basically says, gee, I wonder what's in my food. And he's like, and he looked at the ingredients. He's like, I can't actually tell what's in my food. Who knows? So he did an investigation to figure out kind of what's in his McDonald's Big Mac and Coke. And it turns out that a lot of the answer to that was most of the ingredients are corn and soy based. And so his book helped explain to me something that was right in front of my face that didn't make any sense to me, which is who in the world is eating all this corn? Because I live in Indiana. And I see corn every time I leave Bloomington and go 30 miles in any direction. There's nothing but corn and soy fields. I only eat a little bit of corn, so who's eating it all? So Pollan explained how the system works, how corn is just a commodity crop that can just be kind of taken apart and reassembled in all of these amazing formulations that you see on the back of all the processed food that you like dextrose and this stuff and sorbate and xanthan gum and all that. That's all corn. And so Pollan kind of puts it all together on the domestic front. So all of a sudden I started to see Pollan and Stiglitz kind of coming together. And that was really interesting. And then I worked at the food bank. And so I saw people who didn't have enough food to eat or who had plenty of food to eat, but it was all terrible for them. And I started to think about poor people and their diet and the obesity rates as it affects people in poverty, and started to think about how our food system is a huge set of trade-offs. And so that kind of intersection between food globalization and poverty emerged from that kind of nexus of text and experience.
Well, and you mentioned it too, that so much of the populations in some of these areas and markets is in the agricultural side and the food side. And so when you look at it in those terms too, this conversation is such a huge economic impact for those regions and areas. Kind of getting back to kind of what's grown and why, and it's so much of it is determined by factors that aren't necessarily the local environment. Is this the right food for really everybody to be eating, and kind of beyond nutrition? Were there any key policies or, any kind of part of that process that really stand out that kind of showcase that for you?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the prime mover in the whole system is subsidies. So much goes back to subsidies. We subsidize our agribusinesses to the tune of $20 billion a year. And what that gets us, what we're paying for there, is the overproduction of just a small select set of crops like corn, soy, wheat, rice, and cotton. And so we get the processed food that comes from those basic ingredients. But if we subsidize something different, if we subsidize tomatoes, we'd have a lot of tomatoes. If we subsidize the things that were healthy and are good for us, then we would have those things more available to us at a cheaper price. And the stuff that's bad for us would be more expensive. But you don't see it. That's why they can add like 79 ounces of Coke to your cup for like an extra penny. Because the raw ingredient, high fructose corn syrup is nothing on the dollar, pennies on the dollar. And so it would be great if we reoriented our federal subsidy system. A lot of these questions are questions of poverty. People eat what they can afford. So, but that's an appealing part of the food system to me too, is like, this is an area of poverty that I think if we thought about our priorities and we prioritize public health, I think we could have an effect on the system. This is not like an intractable, impossible problem. This is a problem with good potential solutions, all oriented around trying to localize our food system just a little bit more. And we don't all have to survive on berries and twigs, but we've got a system that's really, really industrialized. And we could probably do a little bit of shifting back towards the way the food system used to be. But one of the obstacles to that is that we pay not very much for our food now. We pay just like 12% of our annual income as a household for food, whereas 50, 75 years ago, we paid like a third of our income. So, we get what we pay for nowadays. We get excess of unhealthy abundance.
Yeah, it does. We kind of been circling around it a little bit, but you're starting to see a little bit more of a trend towards kind of locally sourced food and eating, what your local farmers and your environment can kind of produce in your own regions. Is that kind of the right direction?
That's amazing. That's what we should. That'd be great.
Kind of circling back over to the policy piece of it a little bit. Kind of what gets made, and you've spoken to it a little bit already, but kind of the international trade factor of kind of the food policy and kind of its influence. Do you think that the current COVID situation kind of showcases that value, that the benefits of that locally sourced food?
I don't know. I've been kind of looking at newspaper articles or just whatever's on my newsfeed and trying to see if there are stories about food shortages. And I have not really seen anything like that anywhere across the globe. So I have not seen COVID has not disrupted markets in any way that I've noticed, but I think what can happen is countries that don't have a strong agricultural sector, that they rely too heavily on imports because their own agricultural sector has been made uncompetitive for urban biased policies and commodity dumping and things like that. Then if there is a problem in the supply chain, I guess not COVID, but I'm thinking more like climate related problems, droughts, fires, floods. I think there was a really interesting story from a while ago from the Wall Street Journal. It's 2010. There was a heat wave across the wheat belt in Russia. So whatever part of Russia it is, some part to the west where they grow lots of wheat. So Russia just kept all their wheat to themselves, so they didn't have as much to export. So countries that were dependent on Russian wheat exports all of a sudden found themselves very vulnerable to shortages. And in that case, you did see kind of price spikes and riots and food riots, I think, in places pretty far away from Russia. I mean, down in I think, in Africa, North Africa. So I think in terms of policy, it's probably good as international development policy for us to help developing nations build the infrastructure that they need to have a strong agricultural sector. But we don't do that as far as I know. Like going back to that idea of structural adjustment programs, I mean, basically what we do is we tell developing nations that are in debt that they should cut their budgets for agriculture and for health and for education so they can pay down their debt load. So that's just sacrificing the future for the past. I mean, that's just driving them into a cycle of further impoverishment. Every once in a while, we'll cut them a little break and restructure the debt load, but we never let them get out from under our thumb. And so as a result of that, that just weakens agricultural sectors, these developing nations. They don't have funds for irrigation system and for seeds. They don't get credit. And if they don't have credit, they can't buy the materials they need for the next growing season. And then they become even more dependent on imports from the West, heavily subsidized imports from the West. So then they get in a really bad cycle. And then where all those farmers go? Well, then that's a big demographic move. That's sort of, they move to the cities. They look for opportunities, but it's not good urbanization. It's not like urbanization from the 19th century in the United States or in England where people moved to the cities because there were jobs. These people are moving to the cities and then they're just living in slums, these informal housing settlements with poor sanitation. And so that's bad for their health. So now you have bad health on both sides of the globe, driven by the same economic incentive, farm subsidies. So, and should I go on? It's even worse. Then what we do, if we don't dump all the excess food on them, we give it to them as food aid, which is so cynical. That's just a payoff to the shipping industry, and all the everything. We don't even, all the stuff. It has to be shipped from the United States on U.S. flag vessels. So then how can they compete? How can a country like Ethiopia compete against food that's free? I mean, so that's putting their farmers even further out of business. So they're getting food aid delivered to them while they have warehouses full of their own rotting domestic food products. How do you feel about that if you're an Ethiopian farmer? So these two journalists, these guys from the New York Times, Thoreau and the Wall Street Journal, they were Wall Street Journal journalists, Roger Thoreau and something Kilman wrote a book called Enough, where they talked about this from 2013. They talked about how we're shipping food aid to Ethiopia while they have plenty of food. But why would their people buy their food? Why not just take a bag of free American grain? So the whole system is perverse. And the people who are winning are the big agribusinesses. If you want to really understand the system, you just have to follow the profits. And that's where the profits are. They're in the companies like Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill and Smithfield that control the whole supply chain from the farm to the distribution center. And they're the winners because they add value along every step of this increasingly complex globalized supply chain that works for them, but not so much for everybody else, I think.
That's it for this edition of Cyber Focus. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at cyber@indiana.edu.